In this particular video, we'll be talking about the question nasal cavity, choanae, vascular and nerve supply. Nasal cavity is basically your upper respiratory tract that has paranasal sinuses. Now, the externally, you can see your external nose, which has a root, a body or dorsum, and an apex, right? And it has four cartilages that you can talk about: your lateral nasal cartilage, minor alar cartilage, major alar cartilage. Alar meaning like wings. So, yeah. And then you have your major septal cartilage that uh, forms your nasal septum. Okay, so external nose, we have these are the two diagrams that you can maybe draw or even just explain in terms of using words. That's all right. Now, your nasal cavity basically, they have like two components. You have a bony component and a cartilaginous component. Your bony component, first, it's your cribriform plate. It forms the roof of your nasal cavity, and it is where your olfactory bulb like sits on and your olfactory nerves pass through. It is from the cribriform plate. Then you also have your nasal septum that has two bony components, which is the perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone and then your vomer as well. Now, there's one cartilaginous component that forms the nasal septum as well, which is your septal cartilage. And apart from that, as we have already discussed, you have two alar cartilages and you have two lateral nasal cartilages, which is on the lateral side, on right and left, both sides. That's why there are two of them. Now, this is a diagram of your sagittal section of your nasal cavity, and we're looking at the medial side. So, again, we talk about the bony component, just to revise. You have a cribriform plate, your olfactory bulb sits on it, and then there's your olfactory nerves that pass through your cribriform plate. Then you have your perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone and your vomer, right? These three form the bony component of your nasal cavity. And along with the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and your vomer, you have a cartilaginous component called your nasal septal cartilage. And together, these three form your nasal septum. You have also a few sinuses that you can talk about in this particular section. You have your frontal sinus and your sphenoid sinus. Now, below, inferiorly, you have your palatine bone and your maxilla. Now, the arteries that supply to this particular part of your nasal cavity would be your infraorbital artery, supraorbital artery, angular nasal artery, and your lateral nasal artery. All of these are like branches from either your maxillary artery or your ophthalmic artery, which come either from your external or internal carotid artery. Now, the veins that drain from this particular part of your nasal cavity is your facial vein, inferior ophthalmic vein, and your pterygoid plexus. You can also find submandibular lymph nodes here. Now, innervation, you have your somatomotor innervation and your somatosensory innervation. Somatomotor innervation is given by facial nerve, and your somatosensory is given by the fifth cranial nerve, two branches of it, which is the ophthalmic and your maxillary nerve. Now, when you talk about your nasal cavity or any particular topography, you talk about borders. You have your medial border, which has the nasal septum, as you saw here, nasal septum that has two bony components and one cartilage component. Then you have your lateral border. Now, this is a sagittal section, but you're seeing towards the lateral side of your nasal cavity. You have your concas here, which are like bulgings from your bone. and they help in like increasing surface area and like create an opening, right? And then you have your palatine and your ethmoid bone. Now superiorly you have your sinuses this side. So you have, we saw in the previous diagram, you have your frontal and sphenoid sinus. These are like present superiorly. Apart from that, there's also your ethmoid sinus somewhere here. And your ethmoid sinus itself has like three parts: an anterior, middle, and posterior. Why this is important is because when these concas make openings, they have a nasal pathway that goes into these sinuses. We have a separate diagram for this, probably in the next slide. Okay. Then inferiorly, you have your hard palate, which consists of the palatine process of your maxilla and the horizontal plate of your palatine bone. Now, anteriorly, you have your external nose, and posteriorly, you have your nasopharynx, that passes through like the posterior, forms like the posterior nasal aperture. When we talk about like the openings, they all like end up in the nasopharynx, right? And in terms of the regions, now this whole nasal cavity, you can divide it into or an olfactory region, which is the yellow part, and then a respiratory region, which is the green part. Now the difference is the cells. Your olfactory region, you have olfactory cells and receptors. This is why one of the major functions of your nasal cavity is the sense of smell, because as you know, you have a cribriform plate right above it, like superiorly, and there's an olfactory bulb that rests on it with your olfactory nerves that pass through it. So it has receptors and olfactory cells. Then you have your respiratory region, the green part, which is made up of ciliated pseudostratified epithelium. They contain goblet cells. Goblet cells are mucus secreting cells. Now, the reason is obviously it is with the functions of your nasal cavity, which is to warm and humidify air, remove pathogen, and also drain and clear paranasal sinuses and your lacrimal ducts. These three functions are done by your respiratory region, and your olfactory region is responsible for the sense of smell. Now, again, a lateral view of your sagittal section. I had already told you about like certain bulgings of the bone. They form your nasal concha, superior, middle, and inferior. Now, these nasal concha or the bulgings form openings in the nasal cavity. So you have four openings. Okay, the yellow one is your sphenoethmoidal recess, and it basically connects into your sphenoid sinus. You have your superior nasal meatus, that is between your superior and middle concas, and they drain into your posterior ethmoidal sinus. Then you have your middle nasal meatus, that is made by your middle and inferior nasal concha, and these drain into anterior and middle ethmoidal sinus as well as your maxillary sinus. And you also can see a small structure called the semilunar hiatus, which is seen more clearly when you talk about frontal section. Um, but yeah, and then you have below your inferior nasal concha, you have your inferior nasal meatus that has a connection with your nasolacrimal duct. Now, why do we need these bony bulgings called concha? They create these four nasal pathways, and they increase your surface area for their functions, and it also slows down air speed. Now, why do we need to slow down the speed of air that we breathe in? So that we have more time for the air to be warmed and humidified. Now, this is the frontal section of your splanchno-cranium, and major structures that you can see here are your frontal sinus, maxillary sinus, and the semilunar hiatus that is in between your middle and inferior nasal concha in the middle nasal meatus. right? It's here. Now you also have your orbit. You can see which bones form your orbit here. And then you have your ethmoidal air cells, your crista galli, your perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone, your vomer, and then your cribriform plate. Here it's the palatine process of your maxilla, and we can talk about the meatuses now. You have a common nasal meatus, your superior, middle, and inferior meatus. And this will be your superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. Again, the bones um, of your orbit is also important. Like about this, your zygomatic bone, your maxilla, right? And then yeah, and that's all about this particular diagram that you need to know. Okay, now we'll talk about vascular supply. You have supplies from your internal carotid artery as well as your external carotid artery. From your internal carotid artery comes the ophthalmic artery, and what supplies this particular part or the nasal cavity is your anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries, which are branches of your ophthalmic artery. Then the maxillary artery and the facial artery from your external carotid artery also gives branches like sphenopalatine, greater palatine, superior labial, and lateral nasal arteries. Now, the vein that drains from the nasal cavity is your ethmoidal vein that drains into your ophthalmic vein, which in turn drains into your pterygoid plexus and then into your facial vein. Now, innervation, you have a special sensory innervation here because of its special function of sense of smell or olfaction. It's given by your olfactory nerve, which is your cranial nerve 1. Now, your general sensory is given by V1 and V2, which is your ophthalmic and maxillary nerves of your CN5. And the branches are nasopalatine, nasociliary, infraorbital, and anterior ethmoidal nerve. Now, your sympathetic innervation is given by a deep petrosal nerve, and parasympathetic is given by a facial nerve. The lymph nodes that you can find here are your retropharyngeal nodes and deep anterior cervical lymph nodes. Now, these pictures are from Professor. This particular picture is from Professor Namsowa's PPT, and you certain other diagrams are also like from videos. You can definitely go through Teach Me Anatomy and Ken Hub for like more illustrative pictures. That's where I had taken these from, like certain informations, and that's it for this particular video.